In our discussion on the formation of the New Testament, I had provided you with the dates that most scholars hold to be when the Gospels took written form. Now, armed with that piece of information, you'd be able to tell me what order the Gospels were written in. And that kind of ruins the topic for this week, because what we're going to be looking at is, in part, how we came to arrive at the dating of the Gospels by looking at the similarities and differences between them, and by establishing the order in which Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written. If we go back to the middle of the 2nd century, what we have is 4 Gospels that have attained the status of being authoritative or canonical. Those Gospels were the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, the early readers of these works accepted that these particular Gospels were written by either direct disciples of Jesus or those who were disciples of theirs, so disciples of the disciples. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke weren't grouped together as we think of them today. In fact, they weren't called the Synoptics until the 18th century, sometime after 1776. What was evident about these particular 3 was that they shared a lot of similarities between them, and yet, at the same time, there were also many differences. Now, throughout history, various attempts were made to produce a harmony of the 4 accounts. These harmonizations were attempted to either, 1, provide a historical ordering of the events that occurred in the Gospels, or 2, to smooth over what appeared to be discrepancies between them. And we saw this harmonization effort take place as early as 150 with Tatian's Diatessaron. Such attempts continued on for hundreds of years and have had some of the best minds in Christendom working on it. You had St. Augustine and John Calvin, to name a couple. Using the method of text criticism, early exegetes noticed the similarities in the structure and context of these Gospels. For example, the general sequence of Jesus' ministry follows the same pattern. He starts with the ministry in Galilee, withdraws to the north, then we have his ministry in Judea as he travels to Jerusalem, and then we have the events in Jerusalem. That is the same pattern that all 3 Gospels follow. Focus on similar events. Jesus' healings, his exorcisms, and teaching in parables, we find similarities in the wording of the Gospels themselves. Let's take a look at this passage about Jesus healing the paralytic. Now, even in the English translation, we can see that the wording is exact. Pick any one of the 3, and it reads exactly the same in this first verse. But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. It is exact in all 3. Yet, there are some differences. In Matthew, it starts with, then he said to the paralytic. Mark, he said to the paralytic. Luke, he said to the paralyzed man. Matthew says, get up, take your mat and go home. Where Mark is, I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home. Luke following Mark here. So the question now becomes, how do we account for this wide agreement, yet differences between these 3 Gospels? And this problem, this question that is raised, is known as the synoptic problem. So the definition of the synoptic problem is, how do we account for the wide agreement and yet the differences between the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Now, one of the early attempts to answer this question was to suggest that each of the existing Gospels had a common dependence on one Gospel that was probably written in Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, this theory raises some questions. First of all, why would there even be a need to write these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if such a significant text had already existed? And then more importantly, what is the likelihood that a Gospel written in Hebrew or Aramaic would have been translated so exactly in so many places? 90% of Mark's verses appear in Matthew. 50% of them appear in Luke. Matthew and Luke follow, for the most part, Mark's ordering of the events. Luke in the first half of his gospel and Matthew in the second half of his. And the most significant criteria is the measure of the rate of vocabulary agreement. That is, they used Mark's wording. We just saw an example of this in the healing of the paralytic. So this observation of the exactness that is found between the synoptics leads to the proposal that two of the evangelists used one or more of the other gospels. This theory of literary dependency. Well, at first, scholars who had held the position that there existed a literary dependency between the gospels held that there was a linear writing of the gospels. In other words, one evangelist wrote the first copy, the second evangelist copied from the first, and then the third copied from the second. And this lasted till about the 5th century. In the 5th century, St. Augustine provided the first detailed analysis of the relationship between the Gospels, and basing his theory on the positions that were held by such early church fathers as Papias, Irenaeus, and Eusebius, St. Augustine recognized that there was more than one source being used. St. Augustine held that the first to write his gospel was Matthew. Secondly, Mark wrote a condensed version of Matthew's gospel, and then Luke used both Matthew and Mark to produce his gospel. This is known as the Augustinian hypothesis. Now, while the idea that Mark would have produced a condensed version of Matthew seems to be somewhat plausible, it begs the question, why did Mark leave out the parts of Matthew's gospel that he left out? For instance, he left out the infancy narrative. He would have left out the entire Sermon on the Mount. For the most part, he leaves John out of the picture, and he focuses really on the synoptics. And instead of calling his work a harmony, he calls it a synopsis. Right? He wasn't trying to produce some smoothing over of the Gospels. What he was trying to do was produce a way of seeing the Gospels together. And it is at this point that we start to call the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke the synoptics. Griesbach's hypothesis proposes that Matthew was written first, Luke used Matthew, and then Mark used both Matthew and Luke to produce his gospel. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail more on this because your textbook does a really good job of it. What I'm going to do is highlight just the most basic problem with this proposal, and that problem is this. If you compare the three gospels, you'll find that Mark would have taken the material that was available to him, and in some places he would have abbreviated it, and in other places he would have expanded on the account. Now, those who are opposed the theory, this leads us to the two-source hypothesis, and it's this hypothesis which is accepted by most scholars today. You still have some opponents to it, but most scholars accept the two-source hypothesis, despite the fact that there is no existing Q document. In the two-source hypothesis, Mark wrote first, Matthew and Luke drew from both Mark and Q, as well as additional material that was known only to each of them, which we refer to as special Matthew and special Luke. So now what does this whole solving the synoptic problem do for us? Source criticism has made it apparent to us that the writers of our Gospels were not focused on preserving the exact events or even the exact words of Jesus. Used in conjunction with other critical methods such as redaction criticism, which is how the writers use their sources, and form criticism, which looks at the forms that were used in producing their work, it enables us to see the theological emphasis of each evangelist more clearly